Solomon August Andree was many things. A Swede, an engineer, and incredibly optimistic. But in no way was he an Arctic explorer. In fact, he was always much happier above the ground in his balloon than being bound to the earth. But even floating about in his balloon, not even he could escape the mania and hold that polar exploration seemed to have on everyone during the 19th century. So much so that it only seemed logical to him that why would you bother trekking for hundreds and hundreds of miles through the barren tundra and then back again when you could simply float or fly to the North Pole? At that exact moment, a plan was hatched in the head of Andree. One that would see him take a balloon, fly over the North Pole, in the process being the first to do so, gain all the glory, and not even have to set foot on the ice below. Now it's fair to say that Andree had thought that he had cracked the code that others had missed when it came to polar expeditions. But he still needed backers to fund his journey, and it wouldn't be cheap. He also needed to convince the Swedish Academy of Sciences that they should fund someone to fly a balloon to the North Pole, something that even back then was seen as strange at best. He would go on to give a lecture about how he could steer the balloon, using a system of drag ropes hung behind the basket, and also a sail on the other end to provide some form of power. In the end, he managed to convince them so well that they provided funding to the tune of about $1 million in today's money. And the hype about a polar adventure had gotten to such an extent that even the King of Sweden and that of Alfred Nobel decided that they also wanted to help fund this expedition. So with funding secured from the highest powers in Sweden, all that was left to do was make the balloon, jump in, and with the right northerly wind, glory surely awaited him. Right? Well, nothing is ever as easy as it seems. First, he needed to get a balloon that would last the length of the expedition. Hot air balloons, like we know them today, weren't really the same as the ones floating about in the 1880s or the 1890s. The one Andree had planned to use would be filled with hydrogen. This wouldn't be a massive problem, except for the fact that the seams in the balloon's fabric would constantly leak the gas into the atmosphere, causing, over time, a loss in upward lift. The best balloons of the day were barely able to last 17 days, never mind the 30 needed to complete the expedition. But regardless, for some inexplicable reason, this seemed not to bother Andree at all. So, alongside his two companions, his previous boss Niels Gustav Elkom and Niels Strindberg, a brilliant physics and chemistry student, they set off for Danes Island near Svalbard, with their French-made balloon in hand. Getting everything to the launch site, though, was perhaps one of the easiest parts of the expedition. The only hiccup being a short delay due to ice. This cost the group a day or two. Once they had arrived, the expedition group would then begin the process of building a launch hangar and generating the hydrogen to fill the balloon with. And then, all they had to do was wait for that northerly wind, ideally one that would take them straight over the North Pole. With the balloon filled, the only thing stopping them from launching was the much needed wind. So they waited, and then waited some more. At some point though, the sports ship's captain told Andree that the ship's insurance would soon run out. This would end up forcing him to return if the wind didn't come soon. And with no sign of it changing course, in the end, the decision was given to return back home. They would have to try again next summer. However, when the following summer rolled around, there was a change in personnel. Niels Elkom had changed his mind. He had seen just how much of the hydrogen was leaking from the balloon the first time they had attempted filling it, and doing some calculations, he realized that their chances of making it to the North Pole, never mind all the way to Canada on the other side of the globe, were slim to none. did try to convince the other Niels to quit the, at this point, delusional mission, but he had no success. In the end, he would end up being replaced by Knut Frankel, a young engineer. Then, once again, began the process like last time, of creating the hydrogen, pumping it into the balloon, and waiting for the correct wind. This time around, everything was ready a month earlier than the previous year. The balloon was full of hydrogen, ready for takeoff. All they needed was that northerly wind. And it appeared on the 11th of July, 1897. The three men would then climb into the basket, a 2-story behemoth, with both sleeping quarters in the bottom and workstations above. It was at this point the reality of what they were about to do started to seep through all the excitement and delusion that the three men had been running on up to this point. Andree, who all along appeared the most excited, simply asked, "Shall we try it or not?" The statement aside, even the way that Andree had asked the question had worried the two men alongside him. Strindberg wrote in his diary that he seemed evasive and half-hearted. But at this point there was no real way they could back out. Fanfare, the money, and the potential glory. There was just no way they couldn't go. So the ropes were loosened, and the Eagle, the name given to the balloon, was released into the northerly blowing wind. But almost immediately there were problems. The balloon had gotten caught in a downdraft, pushing it towards the water below. At one point, the bottom of the basket actually touched the surface. The three on board could be seen from a nearby beach quickly throwing ballast over the side of the Eagle to raise it into the air, which it eventually and slowly did. Not before also having to lose the half-ton drag ropes, and thus in the process also losing a significant part of its steering. But either way, they were off and heading north for what they expected to be a 30-day adventure. They were never seen alive again. It would be another 33 years before a single sign from the three men would be found. During an unusually warm summer, a sealing ship, the Bratfag, would be sailing around the unusually inaccessible Co.AG-Your island. The crew, seeing this as an opportunity to explore, made their way onto it. In their search for fresh water, two of the men, Olaf Selen and Karl Tusvik, discovered Andree's lifeboat under a covering of snow near a gentle stream. The confirmation that it was the expedition's came when they found a boat hook, with Andree's Polar Expedition 1896 written on the side, the year they had meant to take off. Then they continued to search the island for more clues of the men. In the end, they would manage to recover a journal and 2 skeletons, the remains of both Andree and Strindberg. A later trip to the island would find less ice and recover even more artifacts relating to the last months of the men's lives. Recovering the tin box with photographic films inside, his logbooks, and even some maps. The materials gathered would go on to tell a terrible story of what had happened to the men when they left Danes Island that day in 1897. The initial winds would carry them north, but from the start, the balloon was out of balance and flying way too high. This had the side effect of causing the hydrogen to leak out of the balloon at an even higher rate than any of them could have predicted. They would fly above the ground for around 10 hours and 41 minutes before beginning a series of hops, hitting the ground, then gaining altitude again, before hitting the ground once again. This bouncing would continue for another 41 hours, with none of the men able to rest or sleep until the balloon finally came to a stop. Once they hit the ground for the final time, they would begin their attempt to make the journey back home, all the while taking photos detailing their trip as they went. They would spend a week at the crash site before before eventually deciding to move towards a food depot placed at Franz Josef Land. As they made their way though, the movement of the ice beneath them would move in the opposite direction. Eventually realizing that their attempts to make progress were fruitless against the both strong winds and movement of the ice, they decided that they would have to winter in place and then move again when it became possible to do so. But they weren't going to get the chance to wait for better conditions. Before long, the ice began to break up beneath them, forcing them to bring their supplies onto Co.AG-Your Island. Even at this point, and even though the expedition had been a failure, the men were still in good spirits. Andree's diary noting several entries about how morale remains good. With such comrades, one should be able to manage under, I may say, any circumstances. His last entry would go on to state, "It feels fine to be able to sleep here on fast land, as a contrast with the drifting ice out upon the ocean, where we constantly heard the cracking, grinding and din. We shall have to gather driftwood and bones of whales, and we'll have to do some moving around when the weather permits." It had appeared that the three men were fine. But not long after this entry, they would all somehow end up dead. Speculation would abound about what had happened to the three men, especially when their last entries had seemed so positive. How had they died? Well, there were several theories. One involving parasitic-laced polar bear meat had caused the men to fall ill and eventually die. Another from vitamin A poisoning from eating too much bear or seal meat. But for me, the most convincing is that of the polar bear attack. Some believe that a polar bear had attacked and killed Strindberg, while also injuring Franklin in the process, who would later go on to die from his injuries. Then Andree, alone on an island miles and miles from any form of salvation, decided to bury his fellow expedition members and then pass away himself through the use of the packed morphine. The empty bottles found near his upright body with his rifle by his side seems to support this theory. Either way, the Arctic had its way with the three men. Their remains would end up being taken back to Sweden, where crowds upon crowds would take to the street to greet engineer Andree one last time. The Arctic had claimed yet another victim in search of glory, but they would be far from the last.